Welcome again. This is Teacher Paul. You're tuned into the second episode of Growing Through Grief, based on a book by Paul Chappell, but our guest speaker, Betsy Mager, is leading us through. And this section talks about the presence of the shepherd. This is needful. This is necessary. Good teaching. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Betsy Mager from Lighthouse Bible Baptist Church, and we're going through a study called Growing Through Grief by Paul Chappell. The last series or session I did was called The Provision of the Shepherd, and now we're going to talk about the presence of the shepherd. And we're going through Psalm 23. We're going to look at verse 4, and in verse 4, the psalm kind of takes a turn. Some people think it's kind of ominous, or it could be inviting. It depends on how you look at it. But it might seem ominous if you focus on the valley of the shadow of death, which it speaks about. But it also could be inviting as we think about the closer relationship that's expressed between the sheep and the shepherd. Because, up until this point, David, who is representative of the sheep, has been talking about the shepherd. But here he starts to speak to the shepherd. In Psalm 23 and verse 4, he says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." So we're going to talk about how there is a reality of valleys in our lives. And if you've lived for any length of time, you know that you have valleys in your life. Walking through a dark valley, and it's the same with Christians. Every time of grief that we have, it's fraught with danger. The valley of grief is dark. It can be foreboding and uncertain. And Satan tries to shoot his fiery darts of doubt or devour us through temptation and sin. Ephesians 6:16 says, "Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked." And 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." So it's the very dangers of the valley that make us need and depend upon our shepherd. Truly, if we didn't have trials, we wouldn't have a need for our shepherd, for our Lord. So the reality of the valleys is there, but also we have a path through the valleys. As dark and lonely as the valley of the shadow of death might be, there's a word in verse 4 that is very encouraging. And that's the word through. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Grief isn't a stopping place. It's part of the journey, and it's part of the journey that God intends to lead you through. He's not going to leave you there. When you're going through grief, you feel as if it will never end. There is an end, and God will lead you through. Isaiah 43:2 says, "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." What a promise we have. God will be with us. And remember, verse 4 immediately follows verse 3. At the end of verse 3, we saw how wonderful it is to trust the shepherd's guidance as he leads us on the paths of righteousness. And then verse 4 indicates that we're still within his guidance as we walk through the valley. When we're following our shepherd, we can be sure that every path that he leads is for our ultimate good. It doesn't feel good. Grief doesn't feel good. When my husband and I lost our son, it didn't feel good. But God had a purpose and a plan. God is holding you in his hands and asking you to trust him. Trust God through your grief. When we can't see the way, when our path is dark and painful, as long as we're following the shepherd, We can know we're on the right path. We don't want to be on the wrong path. And we can't always feel the presence of the shepherd in the middle of the valley. He's always with us, though, leading and guiding and protecting. And he promised he would never leave us or forsake us. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6, remember this. He hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Psalm 54, 4 says, behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. And if we had a shepherd who only led us to green pastures and waters, we would have cause to fear when we find ourselves in a rocky, dark valley. But we actually have a shepherd that sometimes leads us through valleys so that he might bring us out to better pastures on the other side. There's a quote that says, the comfort of the Good Shepherd's presence is all the more wonderful when we take seriously the reality of the darkness and the presence of evil. The comfort is the presence of the shepherd in the midst of the danger rather than the comfort of the removal of the danger. That was a quote by David Gibson. And I thought of a few other scriptures that go along this thought. Ephesians 2:2 talks about the prince of the power of the air. And in Genesis 50 and verse 20, Joseph is speaking, and he says, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. And then we see this principle repeated in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, which you might have memorized, which says, all things work together for good to them who love God. All things. Even when we go through evil, all things, God works together for good. So the Apostle Paul experienced the presence of the Lord to lead him through a traumatic event. And he was a prisoner on board a ship going to Rome. The ship encountered a terrible storm. The storm was so long, it says that neither sun nor stars in many days appeared. And it was so fierce that all hope that we should be saved was then taken away in the book of Acts, chapter 27 and verse 20. But in the midst of that storm, God promised Paul that they would make it through, and he told the others on board of God's reassurance. Acts 27, verses 23 through 25 says, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. So as you continue on the journey of grief, remember that God didn't just lead you to grief. He desires to lead you through it. And then the shepherd has care in the valleys. The fact that the sheep get through the valley of the shadow of death to the pastures on the other side it's no thanks to the skill of the sheep. It's due to the presence and the skill of the shepherd as he uses his rod and his staff. Psalm 23 and verse 4 says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The shepherd's rod was a short, heavy, baton-like instrument, and it could be hurled at predators. It protected the sheep from evil. Well, Jesus is our protector and our deliverer. 2 Samuel 22, 18 through 20 says, he delivered me from my strong enemy and from them that hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. So the shepherd's rod was used to protect sheep from predators, but the shepherd's staff was used to protect the sheep from themselves. It was a long pole with a crook on the top, and the shepherd could hold the bottom, reaching the crook forward and use it to pull a wandering sheep back into the flock. That's a picture of what we do. We wander away, don't we? We are all prone to wander. Isaiah 53:6 says, all we, like sheep, have gone astray. we have turned everyone to his own way. And I think sometimes we're more prone to wander when we're under pressure. So we're thankful that God, with his vigilant love and his rod and his staff, that he can lead us through the valley, and he can pull us back when we do stray. But before we move on to the last 2 verses in the psalm, we need to talk about those who might be afraid of coming out of the valley of the shadow of death. Some people who have lost, particularly if they've lost a loved one, they struggle with the idea of moving on. They don't want to go through grief to the other side because they're afraid that leaving the valley means they're losing their loved one and the connection to their loved one. And sometimes it feels like they're being disloyal. But that's a faulty premise. In reality, grief isn't what holds you to your loved one. The relationship that God gave you and the memories that you have of them, that you share, they're more valuable than the pain that you're experiencing. Moving through grief then isn't moving away from the one you loved. It's allowing the shepherd to heal your wounds of loss so that God's love and comfort can work in you and through you in ways that you didn't even know were possible. Your relationship with God is ever more prominent, and it should be in your life, than your relationship with anyone else. And God will lead you through. It's true that there are some griefs that never fully heal, but even those griefs don't require us to live in the valley of the shadow of death. They stay with us as we continue on our journey toward the table that our shepherd has prepared ahead. So grief is not a journey, it's a destination, and the destination is still ahead. So when you're in the valley of the shadow of death, just keep walking and keep following your shepherd and keep trusting in his presence to guide you.
Hi, my name is Jack Young. I'm pastor of the Lighthouse Bible Baptist Church in Webster, New York. And we are a simple Bible preaching and teaching church in this area. And we attempt to follow the Lord through his word and love one another and fellowship with one another and try to reach our area for the Lord Jesus Christ. You can visit us at lbbc.info, and I do have a podcast, pastorjack.org. You can find us there. God bless each and every one of you. If we can do something for you, let us know.